You're listening to Florida Matters. I'm Matthew Petty. Getting onto the property ladder is tough these days. On Florida Matters, you've heard firsthand what it's like trying to buy a home with affordable houses in short supply and lots of competition. But if you do own a home in the Tampa Bay region, you might be facing another challenge, getting insurance. WUSF's Jessica Meszaros has been reporting on what the homeowners insurance crisis looks like and feels like in Tampa Bay, and her reporting is featured on the podcast Sea Change from WWNO. Hurricane season has brought the insurance crisis into focus as well, the region recovering from Hurricanes Debby, Helene and Milton. Well, coming up, you're going to hear Meszaros explain why Florida is the origin story of the collapsing home insurance market and how sketchy companies and climate change are fueling this crisis. Meszaros' podcast, The Stormy Insurance Crisis in the Sunshine State, dropped back in August before Hurricanes Helene and Milton.
For this story, I wanted to interview people shouldering the burden of this crisis. So I put a call out to homeowners in the Tampa area, along the Gulf Coast. I was inundated. People seemed desperate to talk to me about what they'd been going through. And everyone I spoke to told me the same thing. Until recently, their home insurance was in the back of their minds. Now, it's blowing up their lives.
I'd grabbed the mail on my way in, and I opened a letter and a few expletives came out of my mouth. And it was a notice from the insurance provider basically saying that you're no longer going to be covered.
Just like that, no warning. Sarah Haverstick's home insurance was canceled. For Amy Beer, this crisis started with a stranger at her door.
This guy knocked on the door and said, I am here to inspect the exterior of your house. Your insurance company sent me.
He wandered around, checked out the house. Weeks later, Amy got a threatening letter.
If you don't replace your roof by January 8th, your home insurance will be canceled.
A new roof is possibly one of the most expensive repairs a homeowner will ever undertake. Amy's insurer gave her just weeks to get it done.
This last year, I was shocked that my insurance all of a sudden was canceled.
Maria Lopez says her insurer pulled out of Florida, just refused to sell policies here anymore. She had no say in the matter. Maria was passed off to another insurance company.
They accepted my payment, they sent me a policy, and 2 months later, they decided they didn't want me either. Why?
This stuff will stop your heart. Everyone I spoke to was in fight or flight mode, but they didn't have time to feel scared. They had to jump in, figure out how to insure their homes. Some folks I spoke to haven't been kicked off their insurance outright, but they are being priced out. That's the case for Jeffrey Phillips.
Just a few years ago, I was paying around $5,000 a year for my homeowner's insurance. It's now over $15,000 per year.
That is a 3-fold rate increase. Who can budget for that?
My insurance agents don't seem to be able to help. I've looked on the internet to see if there are other options to have, and I just have found I'm stuck.
Jeffrey's an eye doctor. He says he'd like to fully retire but can't because of his home insurance premiums. Maria, by the way, is a graphic designer. Amy's a writer. And Sarah is a company manager. Sarah is raising young kids. She and Amy were both in remission from cancer when that letter or knock at the door came. Also, none of the people you're hearing from had any real damage done by storms. No one even filed a claim with their insurers, and still kicked off or priced out.
It was such a sort of slap in the face. And the idea that all of a sudden I can just get this notice of non-renewal, now you're not holding up your end of this agreement.
I bought a house in Tampa a few years ago, and honestly, I'm worried too. If I lose my home insurance, I could lose my mortgage. It's an overwhelming thought, so I tend to push it into the back of my mind. Now, Florida isn't the only state where it's getting really expensive or just impossible to insure your home. This is a climate change problem. Insurers are pulling out of states where they're losing money. In Louisiana, they're losing money because of hurricanes. In California, wildfires. In the Midwest, severe storms and tornadoes. Google it. Wherever you live, you'll likely find stories in your neck of the woods about home insurance rates going up. But in Florida, home insurance is in a full-blown crisis. It's worse here than any other state. And it's been brewing here longer. If Florida is where the rest of the country is headed, then we should all pay attention.
This cycle we're in, we've seen it all happen before. Florida seems to be kind of stuck in this kind of terrible loop of insurance crises that have never really resolved themselves. And frankly, I don't know if they ever will.
I don't think I know as much about anything as Lawrence Maurer knows about property insurance in Florida. He covers the state house for the Tampa Bay Times and the Miami Herald. I interviewed him 3 times for this story, and he was endlessly patient. Lawrence says to understand Florida's chronic cycle of home insurance crises, you have to go back to where it started. Hurricane Andrew in 1992.
This is incredible. It has just flattened this area. This can only be described as total devastation.
At the time, Hurricane Andrew was the costliest natural disaster in U.S. history. It came ashore as a Category 5 and destroyed tens of thousands of homes in South Florida. Residents filed about 650,000 insurance claims. Insurance companies, big ones, were not ready for this. State Farm, Allstate, Travelers, Prudential. Some dropped hundreds of thousands of policies. Others just abandoned the state.
A lot of Floridians were left with this situation where they couldn't find insurance for their homes.
And housing fuels Florida's economy. This was an existential threat. State lawmakers had to do something, so they came up with a couple big solutions. Solutions that would actually become even bigger problems. Here's the first solution we'll talk about: Citizens, a brand new home insurance company created by lawmakers and run by the state. It's basically socialized home insurance for people who can't find coverage on the private market.
Citizens is supposed to act like an accordion.
Lawmakers set up Citizens in the years following Hurricane Andrew. And because of high demand from people dumped by commercial insurers, Citizens expanded. It took on hundreds of thousands of homeowners. Lawmakers freaked out.
It violates, Republicans' idea of the government and the free market. When it gets big, there becomes this panic among politicians to get rid of Citizens policies, get rid of these policies, put them back on the private market.
Lawmakers squeezed the accordion. They kicked a bunch of homeowners off of Citizens. So where did all those people go? If the state couldn't cover them and big insurers fled, how did they find home insurance? Here's another solution that became a problem. Florida lawmakers encouraged entrepreneurs, people with no insurance experience, to open new, very small insurance companies. Citizens dumped tons of its policies directly into the hands of these small companies. So let's talk about these small, sometimes sketchy insurers. So there's probably a lot of ways to describe how bad they are. I'm just curious, how would you describe these insurers?
Basically, these companies are vehicles to do one thing, and that is to extract as much money out of the insurance market as possible for their investors.
Here's something that blew my mind. In the same market where big insurance companies had lost money, the CEOs of these tiny companies started making $20+ million a year.
These guys are making more than the CEOs of State Farm nationally, Allstate, Progressive. These guys were getting filthy rich.
Here's how that's possible. Let's say I want to make a bunch of money in Florida's insurance market. Insurance companies are highly regulated. States actually limit how much profit I can skim off of all those monthly premiums that homeowners pay me. But I'm greedy, so here's what I do. I open an insurance company that's only a shell. I don't hire anyone to work there.
You'll never deal with somebody literally from the insurance company because the insurance company often will employ no one.
At the same time, I open a string of sister companies.
You'll deal with a sister company of the insurance company, one that charges the insurance company a ton of money for these services.
My sister companies do all the work for my shell insurance company. One of them handles claims, another does my marketing. I use my sister companies to charge my shell company crazy inflated prices for these basic services. And the financial regulations do not apply to my sister companies. So my shell insurance company does okay, but my sister companies, they do great.
And what it's done to the insurance market is, about a third of every premium dollar gets extracted out of the company and goes to profits.
While lawmakers scrambled to prop up Florida's shaky home insurance market, you know what they didn't plan for? Climate change. In the years after Hurricane Andrew, the oceans warmed up. And then the Atlantic started pumping out hurricanes like never before.
Hurricane Charlie brushed the Florida Keys and then plowed into the Gulf Coast near Fort Myers. Winds were clocked at 145 miles an hour, making it a Category 4 hurricane and the strongest to hit the U.S. since Andrew in 1992.
In 2004 and 5, 8 hurricanes hit Florida. 8 hurricanes in 2 years.
And when Florida started getting hit by storms, these little companies started going out of business. They couldn't handle it.
Small insurers went bankrupt left and right, although the CEOs tend to do just fine as these small insurers go bankrupt. Take former mayor of Tampa, Bill Poe Sr. This powerful politician opened his own little insurance company, and in 2008, state regulators sued him, his wife, and 5 of his children. The family and other executives were accused of pocketing $140 million as their web of companies were going bankrupt. Anyway, after all those hurricanes, more insurers pull out or close shop. New ones replace them. And for a while, also pull in crazy profits. And then it happens all over again.
Hurricane Irma is right over us right now.
One of Hurricane Michael's survivors.
Hell on earth as Hurricane Ian slams.
Hurricane Idalia making landfall just moments ago.
4 massive hurricanes have hit Florida in recent years. The coastal water is now so warm that storms rapidly intensify just before they come ashore. There may never be a hurricane lull here again. Here's where things stand. Florida's insurance market is in the worst shape it's ever been. Citizens is under investigation by the U.S. Senate for allegedly not having enough money to pay out if a big disaster hits. But at the same time, Citizens has been expanding like crazy. In just the last 5 years, it has more than tripled the number of homeowners it covers, from about 420,000 people up to 1.4 million. Meanwhile, private home insurance here is super chaotic. Farmers pulled out of the state last year, and there's this constant churn of small insurers going bankrupt and being replaced by others just like them. Still, the sketchy guys control the market. A few dozen small companies hold 70% of home insurance policies in Florida.
These companies will turn around and give millions of dollars to Florida politicians to finance their campaigns. And when there have been serious efforts to reform the market, these little companies have stood in the way.
Florida lawmakers recently made it harder for consumers to sue their insurance companies and mandated roof inspections for homes over 15 years old. Every time they pass some kind of reform, it seems like their priority is protecting insurers, not homeowners.
Florida is an example of what happened when that risk hit a tipping point. The way Florida dealt with that is basically a lesson for everyone else because, we're already starting to see insurance companies in other parts of the country pull out. We're already starting to see more natural disasters in places that did not see them before. And insurance companies are very good about shedding risk.
I asked all of the homeowners I interviewed, what are you going to do? None of them had a clear answer. Some might stay in Florida, some might leave. Maria Lopez, the graphic designer, wants to stay right here in Tampa. Her daughter lives next door. She loves her little home. But
I think it's a mess. I'm not like a government take all, person. I have my own company. I'm all for independent people and having their own thing, but definitely there's an abuse to the citizen. There's an abuse to people, but there's a lot of people.
Maria got passed around from one insurer to another. Eventually, she got covered for more than she was paying before. It has been so frustrating for her.
But what really got me through all this, when I spoke to friends, is that I have many, many friends that don't have insurance anymore. And this is not like the very poor people, it's everybody.
It's not just Maria's friends. There's data on this. 1 in 5 Floridians are now going without home insurance. For years, I've been hearing anecdotes and reading headlines about Florida's broken home insurance system. Now that I understand exactly how climate change is breaking it, it only leaves me with more questions. What will happen after the next big storm? Who will be able to afford to live in my home state? And if Florida is the canary in the coal mine, what will that mean for the rest of the country?
You're listening to Florida Matters. Coming up, WUSF's Jessica Meszaros explains how the impact of climate change affects the state's homeowners insurance market. You're listening to Florida Matters. I'm Matthew Petty. You just heard WUSF's Jessica Meszaros on the podcast Sea Change from WWNO in New Orleans. Now here's Jessica with some insights into the connections between climate change and Florida's troubled homeowners insurance market. Thanks for being here.
Thank you, Matt.
So you spent months talking with homeowners and experts to try and understand this crisis. What stuck out for you about the people who reached out to share their stories?
Yeah, actually, I started reporting in October of 2023, so this is a year later. What stuck out to me was that, so we did an audience call out, right? We asked people to share their stories, and sometimes, few and far between, we get some responses. This was like, 10 people at least showing up, offering their stories, writing, lengthy paragraphs and actually answering the phone and wanting to talk about this and really passionate about this subject because they're being directly impacted and they couldn't get anyone on the phone with their insurance company. They were just feeling like their grievances weren't being heard, like they weren't being heard. And they were just really happy to speak to me, just even if they didn't end up on the podcast, just to have someone to talk to about this. That was really what stood out to me, that all of these people had a similar experience.
Right. Now, Tampa Bay, of course, is still recovering from the impacts of 3 hurricanes, Debby in August, Helene in September, and Milton in October. Have you been able to check back with any of the folks that you spoke to for the podcast to see how they were affected?
I have heard back from Sarah Haverstick in Bradenton, and during Hurricane Milton, she was saying that she was in the eye wall being in Bradenton, and it was the first time. And other than losing power for a few days and some loud sounds, like they seemed to be okay. I haven't heard back from the others just yet, but I'm hoping to circle up definitely.
Yeah, I'm wondering too. I mean, has this particular season, because it has been so bad for the Tampa Bay region, could have been worse as well. But I guess a bit of a narrow escape for some folks, at least in the most recent storm. But has this hurricane season changed the way you think about some of the issues that you were reporting on in the podcast, like insurance and the threat posed by climate change?
I don't think it changed it. I think it added a sense of urgency. Like, this is not a theory. This is happening right now. If you look at what happened with North Carolina during Hurricane Helene, those floodwaters unexpectedly, the way that happened, I think it just shows that Florida is the canary in the coal mine. And, that storm going up from Florida up through North Carolina, causing that kind of devastation. And then, what we know now about hurricanes is that climate change is making them wetter. So they're dropping a lot more rain. And we saw that with Helene and the devastation that it could potentially, these storms can cause throughout the country. And so Florida's been dealing with this for a really long time. And now we're seeing like this is getting worse and it's impacting more parts of the country.
Yeah, and that's something actually that Kyle Calhoun, who hosts the podcast Sea Change, described. She said Florida was the origin story of the collapsing insurance market. So as these other states experience these powerful storms, presumably they are going to start running into some of these same issues when it comes to insurance.
Right, because, these insurance companies are not expecting these kinds of disasters to occur and at such a large scale. That's the main thing, is like how expensive these large, devastating events have become.
Yeah. Did climate change come up when you talk to homeowners about the issues they're facing, or are they just more focused on the immediate crisis of trying to find someone who's going to give them coverage?
Yeah, that's why I wanted to tell this story, because whether or not they realize it, they're climate change victims. And so they're dealing with the immediate crisis of, oh my gosh, I got this letter, I got this knock at the door, my home insurance is potentially at risk, and what does that mean? And so I wanted to zoom out and tell this story so that we can explain like what you're going through is a climate change issue, whether or not they realize it. So climate change didn't come up as much, but again, that's why we decided to tell this story.
Yeah, I mean, sometimes you have to do that to give people something to relate to, right? Because otherwise it's just like this big concept and they may not necessarily have an idea of how to put that into focus.
Yeah, I mean, I feel like that's covering climate change in general. A lot of it you could easily fall into like theory and just kind of talking about these big issues, but it's about relating it to people. How are you being impacted right now? And some of it was like, oh, how are you going to be impacted in the future? What does sea level look like in 10, 50 years? But it's happening now, and especially after these 3 storms and the devastating flooding that we saw impacting more areas than had ever been impacted before, areas that had never seen flooding before, getting storm surge, getting flooded. Either it's storm surge from the coast or inland people having their rivers and lakes crest and overflow, and just the amount of rainfall that came down impacting people. That is a direct result of climate change.
Now, the problem with the insurance market, though, for Florida goes back quite some time, right? So where did that problem start? And I think you have to go back all the way to Hurricane Andrew.
Yeah. We make a point in the podcast to start at Hurricane Andrew because that was like at the time the most devastating storm that had hit the country. And that's when big insurers started to pull out of the state. And so the state legislators were kind of scrambling. What do we do? Right. And then they created Citizens Property Insurance, the insurer of last resort run by the state. And they were also incentivizing small insurance companies to open up to try to fill the gap, the void that these big insurers left.
Mm-hmm. And that was 30 years ago. So this is a kind of a crisis that's been building for decades.
Yeah. The reporter that I interviewed, Lawrence Maurer, talks about this being, it's cyclical. This happens time and time again. It happened with Andrew, and then in the 2004 and 5 storms, it happened again. And then with Hurricane Irma and Ian, and then now, of course, what's happened in the past few months. So this is cyclical, but it seems to be happening closer together.
Now, you describe Citizens as a solution that's become something of a problem for the state. What did you mean by that?
Yeah, so some critics of Citizens say that its policies are too low to compete with the private market, which is why it has so many policies, like nearly 1.5 million policies. But Citizens is also under investigation by the U.S. Senate for allegedly not being able to pay out if a major disaster hits. It's also part of a cycle of taking on policies, then squeezing them out, distributing them to these small, sometimes sketchy insurers, as I call it on the podcast, which are also unlikely to pay out, and they go bankrupt when when a lot of claims are filed after a storm. So so that's some of the problems with Citizens right now.
And speaking of those sketchy companies, as you put it, I mean, there is the flip side of Citizens is you have all these small insurance companies, and the state is trying to push people off of Citizens onto other companies so it can kind of spread out the risk or get some of that risk off its plate. But those companies, I mean, how do they stay afloat and make a profit when you have these bigger companies with a longer history in the insurance market that are getting out of Florida.
The trick is they don't really stay afloat. That's another cycle of what's going on is these companies, they open up, they take on policies, and basically when a disaster hits, they go bankrupt. But they're making a bunch of money in the meantime between storms. So we saw between Hurricane Andrew and the 2004 5 storms, there was a lot of profit. All right, we talked about that in the podcast. There was profiting of these CEOs of these small companies because they weren't hit by a storm. But basically, there are these shell companies, and they create sister companies that don't have the same limitations in terms of profit, and they charge the shell company of the insurer a bunch of money. And so they're pocketing about a third of every premium dollar is going to profit. And so that's how they're making money. But then what happens is a big storm hits, they're not able to pay out, they go bankrupt. And then again and again and again, these small companies just keep popping up. So they're really not able to be, it's not sustainable, basically.
Yeah. What about the homeowners that you talk to then? What is the takeaway for them from all of this?
The takeaway from them is, honestly, it just seems like they're frustrated. They're kind of apathetic about what's going on right now because a lot of the rulings or, the laws that are coming down regarding insurance seems to be protecting more so insurance companies to make, the state wants insurance companies to feel like they should come here. They want to take the weight off of citizens, right? And so a lot of these rulings that are coming down protect the insurance companies rather than thinking about, well, how is this affecting the homeowner? And so I think there's a lot of frustration that not only are these laws not protecting them as homeowners, but then there's also these shell companies that are not able to get in touch with their insurance companies. And so that's why we've heard from people who are so frustrated, and they were so eager to speak to me. You end this podcast with a bunch of questions, so there's more reporting to be done. Yeah, I think there's definitely more reporting to be done, not just here in Tampa or Florida, but across the country and the world about how is climate change going to continue to impact where we get to live? Who's going to be able to get to continue to live on the coast if we get stronger and stronger storms back to back as we have seen in the past few months? Who's going to be able to afford to live here if insurance rates keep going up, if the insurance companies just up and leave altogether? So there's still, it's really boots on the ground of just kind of real time what's going on out there, and so it's going to take reporters, climate reporters and people covering insurance and people living paycheck to paycheck, those kind of reporters, just checking in with people. How are they being affected? And I think, again, not just focusing on the big policy issues, but bringing it back down to how are people being impacted and what decisions are they making because of these policies about where they live and how they want to live. You've been hearing Jessica Meszaros. Her deep dive into how climate change is affecting homeowners insurance in Florida is on the podcast Sea Change from WWNO. And you can find more of her environmental reporting on WUSF.org. Thank you so much. Thank you. That's Florida Matters for this week. Subscribe wherever you get your podcast and watch on YouTube. Florida Matters executive producer is Grayson Doctor. Engineering support from Dave Anderson, Jackson Harp, and Blake Bass. I'm Matthew Petty. Thank you for listening.